that brings us to today's panel. We are going to talk a little bit about how advocates can use research themselves in their own work. So I'm first going to introduce my two colleagues. These are both research scientists here at Faunalytics. So first up, Zach, if you could take a moment to introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Zach Woldert. Thanks everyone for coming to this panel. Like Bjorn said, I'm one of the research scientists at Faunalytics. I've been at Faunalytics for a little over 3 years now. Before I joined the team here, my research background was mostly in economics and political science, and I've got some experience doing on-the-ground advocacy too. And at Faunalytics, I've done work on a bunch of things. Some of them are beliefs about small-bodied animals around the world, how open people in the US are to taking pro-animal actions, a deep dive on the animal ag industry, and I've also got a report coming out next month on how animal welfare labels affect grocery shoppers. Yeah, excited to talk research with Andrew and Bjorn.
Hi, everyone.
And
I
this is
am,
Andrea.
oh, thanks, Bjorn.
Sorry.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Polanco. I'm also a research scientist here at Faunalytics. Zach and I got hired on the same day, so we have both been working here since 2021. Prior to that, I obtained my PhD in animal welfare science at the University of Guelph. So aside from someone who really enjoys research and using data, I'm also a proud animal rights activist. I have years of experience doing street level activism. I'm currently a co-organizer of Montreal's We the Free chapter. Shout out to Montreal people in the chat if you're in here. But yeah, at work, I'm really proud of the work that I've been able to do at Faunalytics. So one of the first studies I was able to help out with was a study where we compared different animal advocacy tactics on people's animal product consumption. And we also just, our latest study looked at salaries in the movement. So I'm really proud of that. Please check it out if you have some time. But yeah, thanks.
Amazing. We have two really brilliant scientists, and I'm so excited to learn from them. But first, for everybody watching, all of our audience members or advocates, I just want to know how much experience you have in doing research in your advocacy work. So if you're a researcher watching, don't answer. But if you're an advocate watching, I want to hear you. I want you to react with a heart emoji if you have used research before, if you have conducted research before in your work, and use a wow open mouth emoji if you have not done this before. So heart, you've done research, you've conducted research. Wow emoji, you have not conducted research. Okay, this is, by the way, this is an extremely scientific poll here. I think the P is definitely less than 0.05. But that's a joke, by the way. It looks like, I don't know, roughly half and half. I definitely saw a big mix in there. So I'm definitely sensing that people have a broad spectrum of experience with this kind of thing, which is good, but we're going to learn a lot more today. So I want to first jump into it and just ask, so Zach and Andrea, why might a animal advocacy organization conduct research? Why not just leave it to researchers? Why should they take matters into their own hands?
Yeah, that's a great question. So animal advocacy, especially the field where we're using like empirical evidence to guide our decisions, quite niche, especially in like the social sciences discipline. So there's so many unanswered questions. So a particular organization might want to try a new technique or a new program, and there's just basically limited data on it, or there's no research at all. So that is a great opportunity where they can, if they have the resources to conduct their own research, or they could contact another capacity building organization like our own. We've had speakers from other organizations here today. That would be great to connect with. But yeah, in the simplest manner is, I know it seems kind of obvious, but yeah, there's just an unanswered question where they could really use some guidance on. So that can seem kind of intimidating at first. And I think there's this perception that research can be very complicated, and trust me, it can. But there are other types of research that organizations can have the capacity to do if they have some guidance. So there's desk research. And what I mean by desk research is you basically try to get primary data from different resources like governments, like the FOIA requests we heard earlier. That's one way. You can also, another example is where organizations want to, for example, understand the impact of a particular program. So on our website, we have something called a program evaluation survey. And that's just an example where organizations can use a free resource like a template and just modify it for their own needs. So those are just a few examples of where some organizations can do their own research. I know Zach has a bit more specific examples.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to echo a lot of what Andrea just said. I think the main reason an organization might want to do its own research is just to answer a question that hasn't already been answered, right? That's what research is. And a lot of the time that can be asking a follow-up on previous research that's already been done, or maybe tailoring a research question to your specific scenario. So for example, maybe there's research out there showing that the general public says it cares about farmed animal welfare. One possible follow-up to that is, okay, well, does that concern show up when they actually go to buy groceries? They talk the talk, but do they walk the walk, right? And maybe an example of tailoring it to your specific scenario is if a study has been done in the US, but you work in Ghana or Vietnam or Brazil or any other part of the world, do those findings apply where you work because you're working in a very different context, right? Um, Maybe you're considering launching a campaign that uses images of animals to get people to eat less meat. What kind of images are going to be the most effective, right? You might want to use pictures of the inside of a factory farm because that can, show people how kind of horrifying those conditions are. But maybe you should take a page out of the animal ag playbook and just show pictures of happy cows. Maybe you could do a before and after where animals that had been rescued from a factory farm are now living, happy lives at an animal sanctuary somewhere. So you can do research to better inform the approach you take and to try to make it more cost effective too, right? You don't want to be, throwing a bunch of money at one intervention if with a little bit of research up front, you could have done something that was a little bit more, more bang for your buck. So I guess, yeah, the point I'm trying to get across is that there's so many opportunities to do research in your own work, and if there's something you don't know, that's a chance to do research.
Very good answer. One of the advantages of a global movement is that we're working everywhere with all types of animals. One of the disadvantages is that if something works in context A, we don't know if it applies to context B. And we have to be aware of this. And that's one of the ways that research can kind of step in. I also wanted to add that having a research mindset, like just to add to what Zach was saying, there's a spectrum to it, right? There's like a full study that could take more than years, or it could be a simple poll. You could even ask, like what I did, was asking, trying to gauge people's responses to research with emoji reactions. That is like that is the bare minimum of what research could be, but it's still trying to analyze your audience at least a little bit. And I think obviously we wanted to be doing more than that, but there, I guess you don't have to be so scared as advocates to embark on the research journey. So, okay, great. We have all of these reasons why advocates might want to go down this research path, but easier said than done, right? What are some common mistakes that an advocate might make if they're trying to conduct research?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And like you're saying, research isn't that hard to do, but there are certain things we want to like keep in mind, right, while we're doing it. So one of the things that I sometimes see, especially when people are still in kind of like the design phase of their research, is that they're trying to show something to be the case rather than asking if that thing is the case. So your research should be guided by specific research questions. What are you trying to learn? That's the foundation for all of the work you're going to be doing. So for example, instead of approaching a research project from the angle of like, we want to show that people want more cage-free eggs. You want it to be more like, do people prefer cage-free eggs to conventional eggs, right? You want to ask that question. Starting with a desire to prove something, you really risk biasing your questions if you're running a survey or just biasing your design in general. And that's not good research, and it can actually be detrimental to the movement because advocates can misunderstand what exactly your findings are showing and that's not to say you can't still have assumptions, you can't still make hypotheses, but you want to be aware of those things. You want to try to maybe write them down. And if you're taking sort of a more formal approach, maybe you'll pre-register them or something like that, right? So that you say specifically, this is our question, this is what we think is going to happen, but it's not sort of like a systemic bias that's running through um, your entire research trying to get people to say a certain thing because we want those numbers, right? Um, the other thing I want to mention is that I think there can sometimes be an assumption that things are already settled as fact. What the best approach is for a specific problem, how to best run a campaign, what people believe, what consumers want, things like that. And in reality, animal advocacy is, like Andrew was saying earlier, it's still kind of a niche field, right? There are infinite questions to answer, and there's only so much research that we can do but have done, right? That's not to say there isn't a good body of research. There is, and you can check a lot of that out in the Faunalytics research library on our website, just to plug that real quick. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? A really important part of research and science in general is replication. Having a single study is fantastic because it answers the question we have, right? But replication, which is repeating that study at a different time with another group of people, that lets us know if the findings were a one-off or if it's something we can confidently feel like we know because the results are consistent, they hold up, right? And right now, there's more room for replication in our field, I would say. So a single study is really useful, but it shouldn't make us close the book on that particular question. And I think there's also room to recognize that just because things are conventional wisdom, that doesn't mean that they've been tested. The same way certain groups were, classic example, sure that the Earth was the center of the universe, right? We need to test these things to understand if they're true. Otherwise, we're making a whole lot of decisions. We're spending a lot of time and money and trying to help animals without having all of the information that we could have. That's more of an abstract mistake, I guess, than a specific one. But yeah, I guess I'll just sort of summarize by saying be aware of and check your assumptions.
Yeah, thanks so much for those high level thoughts, Zach. I do want to echo the thoughts you said about trying to avoid biased questions as much as possible. Yeah, that is so important, especially because the public is already skeptical about trying plant-based or seeing veganism as a fringe lifestyle. So if there are people doing research in a biased manner where they're asking loaded questions or they're producing, figures that aren't actually representative of the population, it's just going to be detrimental. Like you said, it's going to push us back. So while research is really important, yeah, we definitely want to echo that. That's why our organization is here. Like we have office hours where you can talk to Zach, myself, Bjorn as well. We also have a data librarian, Carl, who can help you find data to answer specific questions. Because like we were saying earlier, actually, I'm not sure if we talked about this earlier, but sometimes we get people asking us about, is there data on XYZ? And sometimes there is. And in that case, you don't actually have to spend your time and resources doing a study, whether it's desk research or like running a survey, because there's already some data out there. But yeah, it's really important to try to be as objective as possible and try to keep and follow the open science framework. And so I have this whole blog on our website about collaboration with social scientists that kind of echoes the open science framework. But going back to the original question that Bjorn asked about what are the common mistakes. So in my office hours, get a lot of people who are doing their own surveys, which is great. I love surveys. Sometimes it's like the easiest method to get specific answers that you're seeking. So the examples I'm going to give are really specific to survey design, but I think it's useful to bring up. So the most common mistake I see with surveys is having a really long survey. And what I mean by that is like you're trying to ask so many questions in this one document. And unfortunately, in our movement, we have really limited resources. So most of the time when I see people share surveys, there's no incentive, which means you're not paying people to take the survey. There's no lottery draw, right? So you're really hoping that people are intrinsically motivated to take the survey. So if you have a really long survey that's like longer than 5 minutes and you're not paying someone to do it, they're not going to be motivated to take that survey. So it's going to in the end, you're just going to have a very low response rate. So that's the first common mistake I see. So when I get people into my office hours, I make sure like we try to cut out questions that aren't relevant to what you're trying to figure out in the first place. And so the second common mistake I see for survey work is what we call asking a double-barreled question. So that just means you're asking two questions within one question. So to give you an example, let's say you are running a campaign on factory farming message and you want to see if people find it emotive and graphic. They might be conceptually similar, but they're actually quite different. So in your survey question, you're incorrectly asking, to what extent do you find this image emotive and graphic? So the respondent, when they see that question, they might just be answering one part of that question and not both, right? So you're going to have to separate out those two questions. So that's another common mistake I see. But yeah, that's it when it comes to survey design. I would say would be the most common mistakes.
Really, really good advice, very applicable. I think when we see the word and in a survey question, we should have a little bit of our instincts kick in. Like, is this one double-barreled? Like, we should think about this a little bit. And I agree that credibility in research is so critical. And this is something I say at conferences and to advocates all the time. Credibility is so difficult to build, and it is so easy to lose. It's the easiest thing in the world to lose. You just make one mistake, and your credibility with certain organizations is just completely tarnished. So we really have to be careful there, especially in research, because research is something that is seen as critical. By the way, for anybody watching, we're going to be going into your audience questions in a few moments here. So if you have any, make sure to pop them into the Q&A section. But I want to know some like more specifics. What are some examples of an organization that you've worked with one-on-one to essentially conduct research? And like, what were they trying to do? Who was their audience? Did it work? Or was it too double-barreled? Like, let's talk about some case studies here. Whoever wants to take it.
Yeah. So I guess the example that comes to mind for me is an organization I worked with from New Zealand called Animals Aotearoa. And I'm gonna not say that again because I'm scared that I'm not pronouncing it right. I'll just talk about the whole process in case there's helpful info for anyone in here. So this group was working on drafting survey questions that were going to be included in a big survey with questions from a lot of organizations. It was like an omnibus survey. They were polling questions, more or less, right? They drafted a handful of questions about the public in New Zealand, their understanding of labels on animal products, and they sent them to me in a Google Doc. This is the kind of thing that I'll work on a lot during my weekly office hours slot. Andrew and Bjorn, like Andrew was saying before, also have office hours. So does Carl, our content director, and that's basically our standing meeting where you can drop in and ask us questions you have, and we can try to help. But anyway, the questions this group had put together were really wonderfully done already. So to be honest, I don't know that I actually did too much here, but basically I reviewed their survey questions and was mostly considering things like how clear would this be to the average survey participant? Are these questions written in a biased way? Does the question order make sense? Are they double barreled? Is the survey too long? Right, like the kind of stuff that Andrew was talking to. And I made some suggestions and left some comments in the Google Doc and walked them through my thoughts after they gave some more context in a meeting that we had. But again, they had already done like a really great job. They considered a lot of these things. I think I'm not sure if they had, but if you're doing research and you're curious about, what are the good techniques. There's lots of resources on our website for this in addition to our office hours. Um, but fast forward a couple of months, they had gotten their results back. They had written a brief report to send out to the media. And again, they'd done really great work. And they sent me a draft of the report and I went through it. Again, made some minor suggestions, flagged a couple of things for further consideration. Because it was for media use and not for something like publication in an academic journal, I was looking at it more through sort of like a science communication lens. Is it accurately communicating the data clearly and concisely? Are there any things that could be misleading or too strongly worded or worth elaborating on? Maybe there's opportunities to give a source for some of the claims. And ultimately, Björn, because you were asking sort of about like, did it work? they said that the polling got them really useful data and that they were able to get media interest, which I can drop a link to in a minute, an example of that. And they followed it up with a complaint to the New Zealand Commerce Commission. Basically, I think saying that people don't know what labels mean or have yeah, want to know more, right? Have certain beliefs around these labels. Um, so again, I don't know that I personally did too much. I'm just giving this sort of like example because it's one that I was sort of connected with in some way that I think is really good work. Um, I think it's a great example of how research can be conducted and the impact that it can have. You can run a high quality survey without too much effort. A little bit of funding is usually helpful, right? But you can see what the results tell you. You can write those results up in a compelling but still accurate way in an effort to educate or mobilize the public and try to affect policy change. It's a really great example, I think, of what something like our office hours can be useful, not just our office hours, but talking to any other researchers really, getting a second set of eyes on your work, seeing if there are any biases you might not be aware of. I know when I'm working on a research project for a long time, it can sometimes be hard to like take a step back and look at it with that fresh perspective because I've been so in it for so long. Um, yeah, so that's the example that came to mind for me.
Just to clarify, Zach, the goal of this survey was to generate media attention by basically showing a disconnect between policy and the public and what the public wanted about issues in New Zealand. Is that right?
That's right. They sort of had this, this is not necessarily surprising, but kind of had gotten the impression that people don't know what labels on animal products mean, like welfare labels and stuff, right? I
Nice.
mean, cage free, free range, those sorts of kind of classic examples. Um, and they were saying, well, we're pretty sure that this is the case. Let's find out if it's the case. And because they had this strong kind of backed evidence backed kind of hypothesis, but this really was the sort of like proof that they needed. That they were like anticipating what the results were going to say without biasing their survey
Mhm.
questions, and then planning on sort of asking, showing the results to the media and having that kind of information disseminated that both people think one thing and that that's not necessarily the reality.
Yeah, very nice. And I think that illustrates why the lack of bias is so critical. Because if we're trying to generate media attention, we're trying to get eyeballs on this, and somebody points out an error that somebody made, like instantly all that media attention will turn negative. Um, so I mean, I think the careful analysis, you're downplaying it. I'm sure you've had a lot to say in the drafting of that survey. So yeah, great work. Andrea, I want your opinion here. Can you give us some examples of surveys that you've worked on?
Yeah, so for the last couple of years, I've been helping out Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. We had a person, Sadie, gave a presentation on her work, but that was separate though. But I worked with different people from that organization. So they wanted to conduct research that investigated the pressure that scientists face when using the pressure to use animal methods in the science as a result of peer review pressure. So, and I also was helping out someone else who wanted to also investigate the use of a particular inhumane test that is done on animals by biomedical researchers. It's called the force swim test. So for those two separate research questions, they are running surveys. So I was able to basically, similar to Zach's situation, they had already started their survey in terms of like drafting some questions. So I was able to look it over, polish it up for them both to make sure like the questions were precise. And making sure like the terminology was consistent throughout. Just little things that I think if you don't have like a background in social science that we're able to kind of help you out with. So for the research that this organization is doing, their goal is to actually submit it to a peer-reviewed journal. So they're in the process of doing that, as well as doing some replication work in Latin America right now. So with some data collection. But the end goal is basically by having this in a peer-reviewed journal that it would ultimately aim to reduce the barriers for researchers that actually use non-animal methods. And then in the end goal, this will hopefully help reduce the number of animals used in science. So yeah, it's a really great organization. I'm really happy I got to help out with that type of research.
Very interesting. So, because the audience here is essentially researchers and scientists, not the general public, did you have to approach this in a different way than, say, Zach did with the advocacy group?
Yeah, and that's a good follow-up question. Yeah, so I remember with the first person from Physicians Committee, yeah, our previous research director and I actually helped her with this sampling method, and that just means like we tried figuring out ways how to collect data from that specific group of people because it's not the general population anymore because the sample that they wanted was biomedical researchers, right? So yeah, we basically helped them on terms of like how do you reach that population. So in the end, it was mostly through I think different like biomedical associations and like networks that they were able to forward the email to the survey link. I mean, yeah.
Okay, very good. Really interesting. I think I'm learning a lot about how advocates can kind of, it sounds like so much of this is context based. And to me, this illustrates that if you're an advocate looking to go about this, really reach out to your network. We help at Faunalytics. There's other groups out there and other individual researchers who can kind of help spur along this research. So I'm going to turn our attention to audience questions now. So here's the first one. I have found that ethnography research tends to give better results than surveys. I'm curious if there are any ethnography research done for animal advocacy and, in particular, plant-based diet change.
Yeah, I don't mind. Great question, by the way. So we do qualitative research here at Faunalytics, and we often collaborate with Good Growth. So when we do research outside of the global north, for example, we like to collaborate with Good Growth because they specialize in plant-based research in Southeast Asia, and they're also the researchers that they have are specialized in qualitative work. So usually in regions where the landscape of farmed animals or a specific topic is under research, like qualitative research is definitely a great first step to understand like in-depth knowledge about barriers and resources that people could use. So yeah, we've done quite a bit of work with Good Growth. The last study we did with them was published to our website a few months ago, where we did a wide international survey in about I think 80 countries, basically. But this one was particularly surveying animal advocacy groups versus general population of people living in these countries, but basically wanting to understand what challenges they face in wanting to try new advocacy strategies at their organization. And although it was a two-part study, so we did a survey, but we also did focus groups. And again, really want to emphasize that Good Growth here was a huge collaborator on this project. They were the lead researchers. Yeah, just a great organization to check out who does a lot of qualitative research as well.
Very great answer. So we have another question. What free platform can we use that has better UI, user interface, UI, than Google Forms for surveys?
That's a really good question because I know Google Forms tends to be like the go-to, right? Because it's in the Google suite. One that I have used in the past at actually before I started working at Faunalytics, I believe it's called Alchemer. I don't know exactly like the extent of their free options off the top of my head because it's been a little while. And we tend to use in the past at least have mostly used Qualtrics for our studies, which is not a free option. Um, but I think Alchemer used to be called Survey Gizmo, maybe something like that. If that rings a bell for anyone. So that's the free one that comes to mind that I've used in the past.
Anything else, Andrea? It is tricky when it's free. This is one of those things where there can be a little bit of a financial investment, but we did have a blog on our website a few months ago with some resources for this as well about replication. So if you have more ideas, you can check there. A couple more questions. We have a data analytics student. Are there opportunities for entry-level work to get hands-on experience, paid internships, part-time work, projects, or something like that?
That's a really good question. Um, I'll say the first thing that comes to mind is I know that there's an organization called Statistics Without Borders that you could potentially um, sign up for and see if you can get some hands-on experience there. It's possible you'd be able to work with a group like Vegan Hacktivists to get some experience as well. Those are the first couple of things that come to mind for me.
Yeah, I was gonna suggest Playground by Vegan Hacktivist. Sometimes like their volunteer postings under that subheading could be relevant to you for data analysis, some of them, so it might be worth checking out.
Great ideas. We have time for one or two more questions, I believe. So, how effective are surveys compared to other types of research for lobbying purposes?
Well, surveys can be super helpful when you're meeting with a legislator, and I'm coming from a US context because some of the stakeholders that we've talked to have told us in the past that when they meet with legislators that they want to make sure that their constituents care about a particular issue. So what we have done is we've surveyed states that are basically under research and given these advocacy groups basically percentages of people that care about XYZ issues, anywhere from a factory farm ban to like what extent they would support that, to what extent they would support like plant-based procurement in hospitals and schools and things like that. So that's one way that that surveys can actually be quite useful to then use that information in your lobbying toolkit. I think Zach probably has some great input here too, given your background.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that surveys are it's funny because in certain fields or for certain people something like an experiment might be viewed as like more like fancier research basically and because there's sort of more that can go into it but I think that for people that you're lobbying typically public opinion is what they're going to end up caring about the most. There's a political scientist there was a political scientist at Yale named David Mayhew who said that did a bunch of work around how the most important thing for members of Congress is always to get reelected. That comes before everything else. So in a similar sort of way, right, what they care about is getting reelected. So if something is important to their constituents or important to the people, right, that they're representing, that's going to be the first thing that they look to because that's ultimately you can't affect change if you're not elected, right? For people who are taking the electoral route. Um, so I think that things like surveys are end up being really helpful because you can very simply say this many people or this percentage of people say this thing. It's super clear, it's super concise. Talking points are very easy. It really drives home the point that people care about this thing, right? If you have something that shows 80% of the people in your district, then I'm thinking about Congress in particular, but it could, or like a legislative body, but it could be true for, nationwide if we're talking about representatives from like the USDA or something like that. If you can show them a big number basically and say this many people care about this thing, that will probably have a pretty big effect on them because at the end of the day they're supposed to represent the interests of the people that they represent, right? So I think that that's actually a very fruitful option. And if I was given the choice, do you want to do an experiment or do you want to run a survey that's more of like a polling type question? If my goal was lobbying, and obviously this is very general and it's going to depend on the specific situation, but I think I would probably lean towards the survey approach before I would do something like an experiment that I think might just take too much explaining for people who are, only going to have so much attention span, I guess, to say it like bluntly, because they have a lot of sort of people coming to them and trying to get them to take certain actions.
Really great answers there. I think this shows some of the power of research, just trying to convince really important people, really powerful people to make a single decision that could have positive impacts for animals. Um, I do have to mention that we have multiple studies that are touching on this issue, including one coming out next week. that is in part about working with conservative lawmakers in the United States. We have two more coming up next year about working with political staffers and pro-animal political candidates as well. So if this is your jam, if you're a political junkie, if you're like really excited about this source of advocacy, we have a lot of stuff coming to help you. That is all of the time we have for questions. Thank you for everybody who asked, and for Zach and Andrea for your really illuminating and brilliant answers.